Welcome to the Debate Project. I'm James Sims, a PE teacher, and I will be your host as well as the moderator for the discussion. The Debate Project aims to bring colleagues together to discuss and debate important questions relating to education for the good of learners, teachers, schools and colleges. Before I introduce today's participants, I want to take a moment to explain how we got here. The idea of physical education remains one in ongoing flux. The domain is seen as a varying concept by various people. PE's traditional motif of simply being a performance-obsessed skill acquisition experience is maturing and developing into a highly relevant 21st century domain of study. Furthermore, the House of Lords National Plan on Sport, Health and Wellbeing, amongst other things, advocates for physical education becoming a core subject in England, sitting alongside subjects like maths and English as a central and ongoing theme within a child's schooling. The report also identified the importance of physical literacy as the central principle that runs through PE provision moving forward, and we thank Dr. Liz Durden-Myers for her contributions to this report. With all this in mind, it is no wonder that online debate roars around these topics. One of those topics in recent months has been the role of conceptual learning in PE. Lee Sullivan, a participant this evening and the head of PE at Upton Court Grammar School, released his book via Scholarly titled "Is PE in Crisis?", leading a much needed change in physical education. Within Lee's book, he references numerous fascinating potential shifts in an approach to PE, but central to them was the concept curriculum and specifically the potential for physical education to be a vehicle for the teaching of crucial life skills such as responsibility, resilience and teamwork. Lee argued passionately that whilst never undermining the core physical experience of PE, concepts such as these could be explicit intentions of PE curricula, PE teachers and PE lessons. Others see things slightly differently. For example, Greg Dreyer, PE lecturer and founder of the miMove app, believes that movement and the intrinsic value of movement must remain as the most central and the tallest pillar of physical education experiences. Greg published a timely blog post titled "The Questionable Rise of PE as Life Coaching." The post, whilst not a specific response to Is PE in Crisis, presented a different relationship between PE and conceptual learning. And it is this conversation between Lee and Greg that we'll develop here today. I'd also like to introduce our panelists. Firstly, Laura Davies. Laura is athletics director and PE teacher based in Thailand and is currently reflecting on the concept curriculum, assessing her department's options, and is in many ways who this broadcast is aimed at, as Laura is right now forming her own answers to this question. Laura is with us asynchronously today as it's in the middle of the night in Thailand, and Laura's contribution will be made via a short video. Meet Vic Merrick. Vic is a PE teacher in a through school in Rome, Italy, and has been working closely with Phil Maith, another of today's panelists, and has been focusing on developing the right curriculum for her school's specific context. Meet the aforementioned Phil Maith. Phil is Director of Co-Curricular Learning at Brighton College Al Ain and is shortly going to be publishing his book, Happiness Factories. Phil has extensive experience in the teaching of concepts through PE that are specifically relevant in his teaching context. Meet Will Swathes, former head of PE at Youth Sport Trust, partner at PE Scholar and PE lecturer. Will has extensive experience of teaching, writing and presenting on the role of PE in schools. And finally, meet Ronnie Heath, founder of Create Development, an organisation serving hundreds of thousands of learners and one that aims to transform primary PE and sport experiences through a positive and inclusive culture for all. We also have Marta Steras-Munn with us. Marta is my co-owner at the Everlearner Limited, a professional translator and conference interpreter, and an experienced teacher of Spanish and French. Marta's role today is to manage the written chat amongst the panelists and to bring important points to our attention. Finally, before we get the conversation started, I want to address the question of why this panel, why select these individuals? The answer to that is very simple. Lee, Greg, Laura, Vic, Will, and Ronnie, and Phil, I think I might have mentioned you twice, were the 7 people who put themselves forward to be part of this conversation upon my invitation to the entire PE sector. With this in mind, I want to reinforce that the Debate Project is for all. It is your project, regardless of gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, or any other characteristic. I would be proud to work with you moving forward, and I encourage all of you watching and listening to consider taking part in future iterations of the project. I'd also like to thank Dr. Srihen Lynch at Phys Equity for advising me on representation and fairness through the project. Now, it's time to discuss, to debate, to converse, and simply to chat. Remember, there are no winners or losers in this conversation. There is simply the quality of the information and the colleagueship between us. Part one of the discussion involves Lee and subsequently Greg making a short presentation about their perspective on the role of conceptual learning in PE. We are going to start with Lee, and I'd like to welcome Lee to the recording, to the conversation. And Lee, it's over to you, sir.
Yeah, good evening, everybody. I appreciate this opportunity to contribute towards this important discussion topic. I will speak to you about an approach I have taken based on my own research and experiences as a current head of PE to better nurture physical literacy and lifelong engagement in physical activity for every student. One key aim for PE teachers must be to prepare all students for an active life through physical education. The current and most dominant traditional form of PE delivery is failing to meet this aim and is not an appropriate model to be meaningful for all learners. In fact, it is often creating a negative self-identity towards physical activity. Now, I know that this is not unique to my context or a new problem. David Kirk has been campaigning against skill drill and sport technique focused teaching for decades. Therefore, I am proposing that we consider a shift in practice, a shift that puts the pupils at the center of the learning experience and not the sport, by promoting a concept paired carefully with the needs of your pupils to be explored in and through sport and physical activity. So how did I come to this suggestion? Well, with over 10 years of teaching PE, I grew frustrated at just how little impact our PE curriculum was having on a large proportion of students. Delivering a sport-driven curriculum, I was left asking myself, why does PE exist in my school? Is this learning relevant and meaningful to the lives of every child? And wondering, could there be a better way? This was also echoed in our student voice, with only 51% enjoying PE, and only 40% of those students valued the sport-specific skills taught. 78%, however, said that they indicated that they wanted to learn the skills and knowledge that would help them later in life. Students were struggling to connect with our curriculum, and the learning had little value to their lives. Ash Casey supported the work of Stephanie Belly and Tim Fletcher in his blog from 2018 on meaningful experiences in PE by saying, when young people could recognize the importance of what they were learning and make connections to life outside of the situation, either present or future, they came to see their experiences as meaningful. And this is what a concept curriculum is aiming to do. Shift the learning of the lesson from one that is skill specific, that for most are irrelevant and unachievable, to one which is inclusive, relevant and meaningful for every learner. I do not claim, nor do I have the evidence to suggest, that a concept curriculum changes long-term habits. I do not claim that by teaching resilience that a child is therefore resilient. I do, however, claim to build schema that can organize knowledge and inform future behavior. More importantly, it will provide learning experiences that will nurture a positive self-identity with physical activity, which could in turn support future habits in relation to long-term engagement. One habit that is well evidenced is the fact that negative experiences in PE will more likely lead to a lower chance of engagement later in life. The messages we have been inadvertently sending to our students about their ability or competence have left many believing that they are not sporty or they are no good at PE. James Clear states in his book Atomic Habits, to change your behavior for good, you need to start believing new things about yourself. I have seen a change in students' relationships with physical activity because of conceptual learning. A common purpose of PE, as suggested in Greg's recent blog, is to equip young people with the tools they need to be active and remain active. Upon reflection, I can understand the misconception that physical activity is lost in a concept curriculum, but that was never the intention. Physical activity is central. In my experience, a concept curriculum does not remove the physical activity, nor does it shy away from competition, developing competence, or challenging the most able. Consider the conceptual objective to be the tip of the iceberg that the student sees when engaging in a PE lesson, when in truth there is so much more happening under the surface. The student sees a meaningful and inclusive lesson based around a concept, when in fact a teacher sees sport-specific learning, differentiation, coaching opportunities, support, challenge, developing competence, confidence, assessment opportunities, etc. It is said that physical activity should be an end in itself, and that is absolutely true. But what if one is not motivated to engage in physical activity in the first place? The approach of adopting and delivering a concept curriculum can indeed bring those less engaged into physical activity and genuinely begin to nurture physical literacy. By communicating more clearly and the meaningful learning taking place within and through the physical education, we can nurture that physical literacy. So since the implementation of a concept curriculum in my school, our student voice has indicated that 89% now value the learning that they get from their concept curriculum. 90% agree that the learning from the concept curriculum is relevant and meaningful, and 80% now believe that the concept curriculum has improved their experiences within PE. So to conclude, I am proposing a solution that worked for me in my context and one that many other schools around the world have adopted with great success too. Therefore, I wanted to say my final point is one of optimism. I am first and foremost an advocate of positive experiences for all in PE. So whether we agree or disagree on how to best deliver these positive and meaningful experiences, I am delighted that we are talking about delivering more positive and meaningful experiences in PE. We recognise the power our subject has and the very real impact we can make on the lives of the young people in our care. PE has a potential to be so much more to so many more, and I hope this discussion challenges and supports physical educators to consider their PE legacy. Thank you very much.
Really well presented, Lee. Thank you for that. And we'll hand straight over to Greg Dreyer, who's going to present himself for a short presentation, his perspective on the role of conceptual learning at PE.
Okay, can you hear me okay, James?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks very much for convening, and huge respect to Lee for getting this book written. Immense achievement, well done. Okay, I can only make sense of the role of concepts in PE if we are clear on the role of PE. And I feel most connected to this statement by McAllister. Physically educated persons should be defined as those who have learned to arrange their lives in such a way that the physical activities they freely engage in make a distinctive contribution to their long-term flourishing. And I would attach this statement by Michael Quinnestead, although I would humbly edit the second PE to physical activity. So the goal is for your students to be motivated to and do more physical activity. We are the only subject area that is primarily concerned with students developing and sustaining certain behaviours. What do young people need so that physical activity makes that distinctive contribution to their life flourishing? They need to make progress in 3 domains, in my opinion: movement domain, the attitudinal domain, and the thinking or cognitive domain. The primary driver for behaviour is the emotional domain. Lee refers in his book to a concept-driven curriculum in which concepts are the driver. I would advocate for an emotion-driven curriculum. Feelings trump knowledge. What a young person feels determines if they wish to come back for more. That's not to say that the cognitive domain is not important. PE has acknowledged this for many decades. So let's explore the role of concepts. For me, the most important concepts are to do with relationships and connectedness each young person has with themselves, with others, and with a range of activities. Our subject is rich with concepts, but my go-tos are different to Lee. Thought comes before every single movement. For young people to connect to the wonderful activities that we can draw upon, we need to start with the concept, not the skill. In that, I agree with Lee. How do we generate power through water or when throwing an implement, for example? Deciding on power angles and trajectory when sending over a net, or understanding the many choreographic devices, etc., etc. Our subject is essentially movement problem solving. Conceptual understanding underpins everything. However, and here's the difference, I love exploring these concepts because they support learning in the subject. This thinking is what I call in our lane, and it supports our purpose. Things become overly confusing, and we do ourselves and the subject a disservice when we concede our lane to other people, or we move out of it. When we adopt a medicinal approach, the healthification of PE, when we become pseudo-nutritionists or fitness professionals, or even psychotherapists and life coaches. The concepts that these fields draw upon are not the concepts that should drive our curriculum. By moving out of our lane, we've lost our soul, becoming a confused chameleon subject that stands for everything and nothing. Lee justifies his concept curriculum in this section from his book. I find it highly problematic. It comes from a starting point in which the perceived deficits of young people are unquestionably accepted and positions teachers as fixers. These are sensitive, complex issues, and I would argue that there is significant potential to do more harm than good. For example, let's take obesity. This is mentioned 18 times in the book, usually with the verb tackle or fight attached to it. Paul Gately, Professor of Child Obesity, is clear that the single most important thing schools can do to support obese children is not to tackle fatness, but tackle the bullying that overweight children are incessantly subjected to. Also, these so-called crises listed here are filtered, selective, and time-sensitive. For example, competition for jobs is actually not very tough post-Brexit. There are lots of sectors that simply cannot recruit. And what happens too if it comes to light that other subjects are teaching this content more effectively? Where does that leave us once we've changed the PE curriculum? Not that I'm advocating for the PE curriculum to remain unchanged, I'm just advocating that this is not the change. Lee mentions transferability over 80 times in the book. The message is clear that the big ideas discussed, quote, prepare young people for life. I think we should prepare young people for an active life, but not make claims that what we teach in PE transfers into other areas of life. Some very well-established programs have made these claims, like TSPR, and they've been around long enough for the research to be clear that transferability is at worst a myth, or at best extremely difficult, and requires at least a coordinated effort across all stakeholders, all of whom need to be very well trained. See Kamire, Ronkanen and Peel, for example. Finally, it seems impossible to claim these outcomes. For example, if a young person displays resilience, how on earth do we know that it's because of the resilience unit in PE? And I have big questions as to whether these concepts can be taught via the acquire, connect, transfer pedagogical model that's described. You claim that they can, and that learning is irreversible. Quote, it is not possible to reverse them, you say. So I'm really curious to know more about how you assess them and how you evidence impact, transferability, and irreversibility in particular. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Greg. Really well presented. And this part of the discussion now takes the form of Greg and Lee opening their mics, and we really just want to open the floor to you two to ask questions, to clarify based on what one another have said. We've got a loose time of 10 minutes to do so. Obviously, I'll chip in and ask questions and make suggestions as we go. But I really would like to open the floor to the both of you now to address the points one another have raised and to seek clarification, to find shared ground and to seek the solutions to the small differences there might be. Please go ahead.
Evening, Greg. Not a fan of the book then.
Well, I'm a fan of the fact that you got it out there. I think that is really commendable. And of course, by so doing, you put your thoughts out there, which means that, you know, they can be critiqued and they can trigger conversations. And I absolutely respect that. But yeah, I do have serious concerns that people will read the book and pick it up lock, stock and barrel. And, you know, you on the one hand, kindly share your curriculum materials. And, you know, I just think the concepts that you flag up, I really worry about them. I don't think that, I think they reflect a very specific view of the world. They prepare young people for what you call life, but it's a version of a good life that I'm not sure we as teachers have got the authority, the philosophical authority to decide what constitutes a good life when you're talking about employability and you're talking about, you know, I also really worry, and I'll shut up in a second and bump it back over to you, but I really worry about some of the contradictions that jump out at me. And I don't know if other panelists and other people listening to this pick up on them, but, you know, you talk about a lot about resilience, a lot about employability, going after scarce jobs. And then on the other hand, you talk about managing stress. Well, as I said in my presentation, that's really complex. The root of the stress is probably quite a lot to do with the education system and from teachers telling kids they've got to work so hard to get the best jobs, to go to the best universities and all the rest of it. So I advocate for a model of PE where we don't attach a why. You know, I'm really curious as well about this phrase you use about seeing the value of physical activity. You know, I think the whole work of Tim Fletcher and Deirdre Nee Cronin, the brilliant work that they're doing in Meaningful PE, is very much about the young person finding their why. And, you know, when we tell them, oh, you know, physical activity is highly valued because it keeps you healthy. One, I don't think that's motivating. Two, I don't actually think it's very true. There's lots of physically active people who are not particularly healthy because of the activity that they do. So, you know, but that doesn't mean it doesn't bring something brilliant to their lives. So I'm probably talking for far too long. I do apologise. Over to you. And feel free,
look,
you know.
Greg, I really, really value your opinion. We've spoken now. This is the second time I'm speaking. And I really value your opinion. I do disagree with some of it, of course. So I can talk about my personal experiences, and I think it's important to understand straight away. I've seen the impact of conceptual learning firsthand, and I've seen not only through my observations of lessons, but our extracurricular program now is bursting with students. And I think to say that, you know, in terms of the concepts I have chosen, I've been really, really clear that context is always king. So if the concepts that work in my school, we in the concept curriculum give templates and training on what you should do with regards to what concepts might work in your school. We did lots of student voice as to what is it that you think is going to prepare you for life and how can we help that. There were certain concepts that we didn't use. There were some that we felt could be used in PE. I think PE is one of the best places to use. I think we're best placed to deliver concept curriculum because we can provide something that no other subject can. So something called heat experiences. Now, this heat experience, whereas other subjects might be able to, they might be able to deliver the theory, etc., we can give them opportunities to experience it firsthand. If we're talking about embracing failure, we can set up a lesson where they fail and where they can put those concepts really into practice, and we can see that the progress that is made. So by introducing this concept and then allowing them to practice and to wrestle with it and to change their thinking is really, really powerful. You mentioned there about how do we know the impact, or, you know, how do we evidence that impact? And there is, I mean, Ofsted, for example, the inspecting body in England, when they come into a school and looking at personal development, they just look at intent and implementation. They won't give you any, they won't look at any measurement with regards to impact. That's not to say that there isn't one. So we have, so for example, you just mentioned exam stress there. I had a student come up to me, so we brought that unit forward because they were doing their mock exams and we didn't know whether they were going to get more exams in the summer. So we thought, let's bring that unit forward. And I have a student that came to me and talked about that they walked past me in the corridor after one of my lessons and said, "Sir, I went to bed at 9 o'clock last night following our lesson. Are you proud?" And I know it's a small little thing, but it was just an impact of something we learned in PE that then changed that practice. One other student I got this, I'm going to read it out if that's okay, but this is something that another teacher sent to me, not attached to PE, but this is from a year 10 girl. She said that PE has never been one of my really looking forward to subjects. However, this year I want to have PE every day because it's so much fun. It isn't based on a sport, it's not sport orientated any longer. It's now based on lifelong skills and concepts, which is really cool. Recently, we learned about the impacts of a sedentary lifestyle, and so I decided to join the badminton club after school, and I love it. That is huge impact to me. That's what gives me the goosebumps. That's seeing somebody in our PE lesson and then try and change something of their life. And this idea of self-identity, you know, I talk about transfer, and I said in my opening statement, I don't have the evidence, long-term evidence. Ofsted will tell you that you can't gather evidence while they're still in school of anything long-term, of course. But I do have that evidence of the behaviour whilst in school. I do have the student voice telling me that they find it now far more valuable to them. And you mentioned Stephanie Benny and Tim Fletcher, and their personal relevance is a large part of their meaningful PE. And I think it's up to a PE teacher to understand their purpose, why PE exists in their school, to talk about the who are the students, what is it that's going to make this personally relevant to them. And in my school, it was delivering meaningful lessons that the students could see the value of long term. They could see that by learning this skill, I can apply that later in life. And the transfer element, the acquire, connect and transfer, which is Julie Stern's work, learning that transfers. The transfer element is so important to the lesson to get them to consider the learning that's happened, but where else immediately and long term might it be applied? And some of the answers I've had, both present and long term, have been really, really powerful.
No, I respect where you're coming from there, and what's very clear is, you know, you're going to your processes to do best by your students are absolutely commendable. I do have issues with the fallback position of it's dependent on context. As I said, you know, if I was flicking through your book, the curriculum map, those headings, those year priorities and year aims are very bold. As I said, I think it's very easy for someone to pick that up. However, the point specifically on context is what we're talking about here is, for me, what's at the very heart of the subject, a subject that I, and you know, everyone on this panel and probably everyone who listens to it feels a huge amount of affinity to, has, you know, dedicated huge amounts of our professional lives to. And I feel we're talking about the very soul of the subject. What is it? What's the absolute driver? You use that language, a concept-driven curriculum. The concept is the driver. That's fine. I think emotions should be a much stronger driver. I think that's the connectivity. But with the exemplar material, then if I'm thinking, oh, what is a concept? And people have been grappling with this for years. You know, what is a concept? What does it look like? And there I pick up a book that's about concept-driven curriculum, and there are the concepts that are presented very uncritically. And I do, as I've said, worry about that. You know, with all due respect, I'm not sure, even though I've got the utmost respect for the anecdotes that you've given and the testimonies that you've given, I'm not sure it's enough. I'm not sure it's robust. I'm not sure that if in any other sector outside of education, you know, I regularly say, imagine if Starbucks don't know how many coffees they've sold. That is their single priority. Imagine if Ronnie had no idea how many schools were using Create Development. You know, imagine if your maths colleagues didn't know the progress that the young people were making towards their maths GCSE grades.
But I know that stuff, Greg. So can I just jump in? So firstly, I have that same affinity. I absolutely have that same affinity to PE. I'm passionate about PE and the future of PE. And, you know, I want to go back into my opening statement just to correct that misconception that the physical activity is still...
I'm not making that misconception, Lee. I've never bought into that misconception, and I've never said It is what we're talking about is the reason why they're doing the physical activity and how we're layering. You know, Dave Worcester said on Twitter the other day, you know, bake in, not bolt on. And I'm like, no, it doesn't need to be baked in. What needs to be baked in is the now casting. We need to know now whether our young people are engaging in physical activity and whether what we do encourages them to do more. Now, anecdotally, you said that your extracurricular provision is going through the roof. Brilliant. And you know what? If you've got robust evidence that your physical activity levels, for me, Quinishstead, the only sustainable goal is to get them to want to do more. Full stop. You know, if they're not doing it, you could talk to you blue in the face about resilience. They're not developing resilience if on a Saturday or a Sunday or during their 6-week school holiday, they don't do any physical activity. And if they do physical activity in the absence of resilience or any of these other concepts, just because they love it, let's take the win. And that's why we've invested the last 3 years of our lives and a huge amount of funding to give you the tools to know, are they doing more? Because we've never had that before. And that's absolutely driven by people like Quinishstead, people like Tim Fletcher and the work that they're doing, to say that's all fine, but we need to anchor it in knowing whether we're heading in the right direction and then get that robust evidence. And you know what, Lee, if you come back to me with that robust evidence, you know, I'll absolutely eat my hat that they're more active and over a long-term period. But I'm not sure that you, me, or any teacher around the world should be devoting a huge amount of time and effort and reworking curricula based on developing a concept that we've got no way of knowing whether that's having any impact on their young people's life, apart from, and I do get qualitative research and I do get, you know, capturing those testimonies, but, you know, I don't know how many kids are in your year groups, 180? You know, let's really go to town. Does this stand up and does it do what it says on the tin?
Yes, I with all due respect, Greg, I completely get where you're coming from an academic point of view. I can, as a current head of PE, only talk about my experiences and only talk about the conversations. And that's not to say that this isn't evidence back or research informed. I've done huge amounts of research. I've done as much evidence gathered as much evidence as a head of, you know, a full-time working PE teacher can do. And I do think there is a huge disconnect between the research and practice, which I've tried, but the main purpose of his PE in Crisis was to bridge that gap. And, you know, I genuinely believe, and with everybody that I've spoken to, the impact, we are seeing it on the ground. We are genuinely seeing it and feeling it and hearing it on the ground by the uptake. And
I think that's great, Lee. I think that's great, Lee. And just to clarify, I taught for 16 years before I spent 14 years in academia. So I do think, you know, I really do understand the pressure of your job. And that's why I started off by commending you for writing a book, because I could not comprehend. I get it, lockdown. I think that was probably in your favour. But, you know, this obviously started before lockdown. The research stuff, yeah, I accept that there is a disconnect. That was something we tried with my colleagues very hard to see how we bridge that. And we're always doing that in PE Scholar, etc. But let's not boot into touch what I referred to in my presentation, that these ideas, especially around transferability, have been research pulled apart, explored by distinguished academics. Now, one of them, Martin Camire in Canada, was a really strong advocate for positive youth development through sport. And in the last 6 months, I don't know if you've caught his work and podcast, he's absolutely pedaled back and said, whoa, you know, we mustn't be these evangelists who think we are, you know, saviors and fixing all of these issues, whether it be obesity or, you know, a horrible phrase, the snowflake generation. There's such deficits inherent in there. I see young people every day doing amazing things. I don't want to fix them. I want to just put a turbo boost behind them and just let them fly, because they're doing fantastic things. And this idea of we have to embed, or as Dave said, bake in resilience and other deficits or understanding health. I really don't think, despite what the testimony you referred to, I really remain unconvinced, having asked you know, thousands of my trainees. Are you active because when you were 12, someone told you it was good for you? And no one ever says that that health message is what captures them into an active, healthy lifestyle or active lifestyle.
One thing that we are missing here, so the transferability, the evidence is weak. And I've given you my own testimony, and I've told you that I can't evidence 20 years down the line because we've only implemented it this year. But what I just want to talk about students' experiences for a second, because if through looking at relevancy of learning, if delivering a life lesson as a focus, and also, you know, let's not, pedagogy is massive here. So if we're going with, we need to understand the you know, we are changing our pedagogy. We're changing this idea of performance for life versus performance for fitness. We are sorry, fitness for performance, and as Harris and Kale talk about, but we are talking essentially about changing the experiences of people within PE. Dr. Ekikakis talked about if improvements in PE experiences could inspire even small increases in physical activity, millions could derive additional benefits. I'm telling you that through this concept curriculum, we have seen it. We've got the student voice, and not just mine. This is around the world. A lot of people that have bought into this approach. This is one approach that the main aim is to meet that purpose of PE, is to get people involved in physical education, and by making it meaningful and relevant to them, that is how they are buying in. I've seen that in my school, they are buying into PE far more than they've ever done, because they now believe that it holds some relevance, a connection, it builds that connection.
Sure, I get that, Lee, and I really welcome your enthusiasm. So two things. One, to make PE better, is that the route we need to go down?
It's worked for me.
Okay, and I'll come back to that point right now. Two, it's worked for me. Now, I'm not going to challenge your lived experience, but I will challenge the line of argument, the correlation. I did this and this is what happened. So let's look at what else happens. You've got teachers who you've led, who have gone through a brilliant process that people like Will, people like myself absolutely advocate for. Start with your rationale, take it through. So you've got teachers feeling really secure. And if anyone knows how this works, I'd be really interested for Ronnie to come in here, because he spent years developing a secure, easy to understand curriculum. So when teachers are equipped with that security, that roadmap, they feel supported, they feel that they've got their colleagues back, great, that they come to life, they're energized, they're enthused in a way that they weren't before. And that was your journey. I was burnt out, I was fed up, I get that. All of a sudden, you're coming into school, you're coming into each and every lesson as if, right, we've got this, kids, and we're all on a journey. I love the part on your podcast when you said I over-communicate. So of course they're going to give you, if I'm being cynical, of course the kid's going to give you back what you over-communicate to them. And all of that feel good around your department, being visited, great traction, of course it makes people feel good. Now, you could do that, you could take, and I'm not saying yours is, but you could take the world's worst curriculum, deliver that with enthusiasm, charisma, togetherness, we're a team effort, bring the kids with us, and they're going to say it's much better than it was before. What we can't do is isolate for certainty that it's the curriculum. However, we can take a principled philosophical position, because principles are the foundation. They do not budge. That is this what we want to do with the subject that we hold very dear? And I would argue, no, it's not.
Yeah, well, look, Greg, as I say, I respect your opinion, and we actually agree on so much, especially around emotions and understanding the feelings that people have towards physical activity. I think that the disagreement is the ways in which we are trying to ignite those positive connections and relationships with physical activity. And I certainly take on board your argument. I'm going to stand fast with because I see it every day, and because I understand the physical literacy to really nurture it. We've got to develop this idea of motivation. We've got to focus around motivation. And yeah, pedagogy, you know, I had the same department before concept curriculum and now, And they're really enthusiastic teachers that I work with that are brilliant at getting people on board and getting people there. But just a slight shift and just talking to those students that might not have been seen before, and changing those slight focus within lessons. We're still focusing on the competence. We're still developing the skill. I guess what I'm trying to say is, in a subject that is doing more harm than good, in a sport-driven delivery, is changing for the relevancy and for a better connection and a better experience with PE, is moving to a concept curriculum such a bad thing? I mean, so if in 20 years they can't say, actually, because of that PE lesson, I can't equate it to that PE lesson, I was being resilient, or they still, when they're 18, have that glass of wine despite the fact that we told them that alcohol isn't great for them, but they now have such a more positive self-identity with PE. Is that not a brilliant outcome of a concept-driven curriculum?
Well, first of all, I could wheel in plenty of teachers, and I'm not advocating for this at all. I could wheel in plenty of teachers who work in very specific schools, for example, independent boys' schools, who could come in here and tell you exactly the same thing about their sports-driven, performance-driven, competitive sport-driven curriculum, because they get out 7 teams on a Saturday and all the kids are really into it. Now, we know, the research tells us, in the same way the research gives a window into some of the things you're talking about, the research tells us that most of those kids won't be fully engaged in physical activity after the age of about 15, when the dropout is huge. So, is it a bad thing? Well, let's be really blunt here. If you're talking about tackling obesity, and I don't want to do you a disservice, but you talk about that a lot in the book.
But we would do, though, right? Well, maybe not tackle, but we would certainly play our part. If more people are now active because of how they identify with physical activity, then that is surely going to have, if every school had, whether it's concept curriculum or not, if every school knew their students, the who, Will Swaves talks about the who, starting with the who a lot. If we knew that, and then we understood our purpose of PE around the who, whether it's a concept curriculum or not, then we are doing our bit to tackle those things.
Sure, but you're asking PE teachers to go there and talk about stress management, to talk about nutrition, to talk about life coaching and employability.
But why can't we? Why is that?
Because that's really high risk. It's really high risk. Well, our job is not to quote unquote fix those things. We are blatantly not qualified to go there. Now, if we mess up on that conversation,
we're in a great position to do that. I think we're in a fantastic position through heat experiences. We can get them to embrace failure. We can show them. We can give them the understanding, at the very least, the understanding of ways in which they might manage their stress,
Sorry, how do you know how to manage stress, or to teach young people how to manage stress?
Because
that's therapy, that's counselling.
Yeah, but we understand the basics of it.
The whole point about complex issue, well, okay, I don't know, and I take my hat off to you. If all your team are qualified counsellors and therapists, then
we're not looking at tackling, a real individual. What we're looking at is we're giving them a broad understanding of an area. We're giving them some knowledge for which they can then the tools, if you like, to the scheme that they can then connect to other situations, and that's
that's filtered though. But that's super filtered. But that's super filtered. The concepts the following concepts, which I would argue are more important, are not mentioned at all in the book.
And that's where context, you might have different might have different focus. But I know for my kids, I absolutely want my kids to know everything that is in my concept curriculum. And when
of course,
as a PE teacher, my main driver for the concept curriculum was what experience, what learning, what do I want my kids to come away with? And if they get the opportunity to experience what embracing failure is.
I'm sorry, this is not way beyond embracing failure. If they're going to be involved in physical activity, let's look at what you refer to as the basics. The basics are that every single individual feels safe and secure, valued, and has their dignity, and that the curriculum supports that. Social justice is probably the underpinning concept that we need to work through. What constitutes good? How do we relate to each other? How do we congratulate each other? How do we feel empathy? How do we feel kindness?
So we can deliver that. We could absolutely.
That's absolutely fine. But that's absolutely fine. But you've gone to extraordinary lengths to present that. Racism, race is mentioned 0 times in your book. Social equity and is mentioned 0. Sexism is mentioned 0. Autism, autistic, disability is not mentioned at all.
I agree with you. Those things can absolutely be a part. I haven't included them, but that's not to say they can't be included. I completely agree.
So we're in a super contested space about what concepts really drive physical activity. If I'm a 14-year-old young woman and I really need to know, to prepare me for physical activity in the big wild world, I need to know what sort of misogyny might I experience? How do I deal with that? And more importantly, the 14-year-old boys need to know, how do we make safe spaces for girls? They're key concepts. And I said in my presentation, the key concept is how we relate and connect to ourselves and to our and those people around us, because they promote physical activity. They allow physical activity to happen.
I would genuinely love to meet with you and other people that from various backgrounds to write that scheme of work.
Can I jump in here?
That's what you feel is needed.
I think this is a great moment. If I can bring Laura Davies' point in, I think it's highly relevant at this point. Now, this is the bit where I probably mess up the IT of this, but I'm going to try, if I can, to bring Laura's question to you both, because I think it's really relevant. I would just like, if you could just confirm a thumbs up for me once I play Laura, that you can definitely hear her.
Hi everyone, my name is Laura Davies. I'm the head of PE at an international school in Thailand. And just before we start, I want to say a huge thank you to James and to all the panelists for putting this event together, and for what I think is going to be a really exciting conversation. To give you a little bit of background on my position, my school does not currently have a concept-based curriculum. It's something that we're actively exploring. We've engaged in the PE Scholar course, reading Lee's book, and having discussions in our department, and it's something that we are, really interested to kind of explore further. So I was really interested to be a part of this debate because recently I listened to the podcast that James did with Dr. Srihan Lynch, and she talked about this idea that often our practice and our philosophy doesn't quite align, and I think that's really true, and it's certainly been true for me. And when I've thought and reflected on what my philosophy is and what I want it to be, it's to make PE as inclusive as possible. And I'm not sure that I've always done that as effectively as I could. So one of the things I want to explore is whether a concept curriculum potentially would be more effective in doing that. When I've been listening to the debate so far and engaging with people on Twitter and reading all the comments, I think what struck me is that actually at the heart of it, we for the most part want the same thing for our students. We're all passionate about making sure that they are lifelong movers, or as Greg put it in his article, that movement remains a focus of our subject. And I don't think that what's being proposed in terms of the concept curriculum is necessarily, distracting from or replacing that. And perhaps a disagreement, about how we get there is, a good thing, and something that can help move us all forward. So I read Greg's article with a lot of interest, and I did particularly understand his concerns about how these life skills are taught and who decides, what they should be, who selects them. It's not, if we talk about resilience, for example, it's not something we've been trained to teach necessarily. And so I do understand the concerns around that. And I wonder if Lee might be able to speak to that a little bit later on this evening. But the article also states that, with having, your why, your core aims of PE, that why we move and what we learn through moving shouldn't necessarily be a driver. And again, I suppose my question then for Greg would be, you know, could exploring this with students, you know, actually help them to want to be, you know, motivated to move and want to, you know, motivated to continue to move throughout their lives. Something I've been very interested in over the last, you know, few years is developing my understanding of identity-centered learning and social justice issues in PE. And again, I've been reading Dr. Srihan Lynch's work on pedagogies of social justice. And in that book, she talks about, you know, the ideas of democratic pedagogies. And I know, Lee, you touched on this in your podcast conversation with James, where you talked about, you know, student voice and how important it is in gathering that before you kind of construct your curriculum. And I know, Greg, you on Twitter have been very vocal about, you know, the need for greater understanding and knowledge and learning of DEIJ. And so I suppose in closing, for me, the question that I'd like to put to you both tonight is, does a concept curriculum potentially lend itself better to exploring those issues of student identity and social justice? Thank you so much. Really excited to hear what you all have to say.
And a big thank you to Laura for that contribution. So the question there is, can the concept curriculum perhaps open that world of developing those educational experience of democracy and social justice? And I'll open that up actually to everyone in the group, and I'm sure Greg and both Greg and Lee will be keen to respond to that. Far away, Greg.
Well, yeah, Laura, I think she posed one question directly around teaching around the issues of social justice in PE. And yes, I'm an absolute advocate for that, but I'm going to put some provisos in here. One, the reason we're doing that, apart from our philosophical attachment, for most people going into education do sort of want to make the world a bit better, but you know, whether we're authorised and knowledgeable enough to do that is a huge question. But for me, coming back to where I started, social justice allows access to physical activity for people who have traditionally been denied physical activity, and that comes very much down to our policies, our practice, our pedagogy. So inclusive pedagogy, I think there's a huge amount of work to reframe and reimagine what it means to be good in PE. And interestingly, you know, this conversation and Lee's book still has that high ability phrase thrown in. And, you know, my question is, well, what does high ability mean there? And it normally means the most athletic kids. And that doesn't marry with kids who are making progress in other domains necessarily. It could do, but it doesn't necessarily. But the point that Laura addressed, do we teach it? And this was my proviso. I worry, and it maybe it's an unfounded concern, that when we talk about teaching, we're talking, and this is why I questioned the acquire, connect, transfer pedagogy, because it seems to start with the instruction or with the teacher explaining the concept. And for me, you know, I'm a big fan of exploration before explanation, and not necessarily within one lesson. So I think the key thing is, when do we explore these things? When do we go there? Away from social justice, if you take skill and technique, for example, which of course, I think we all agree, you know, is probably presented and has been a malaise, as Kirk describes, the idea of the idea. PE is sports technique. But skill and technique development does have a place for some kids when they've got strong traction and affinity and identity with an activity. So when they want to know how to do it better, because we framed it as a problem-solving area, for me, I think we should only go there at sort of right at the end of Key Stage 3, early Key Stage 4, when we talk about specific techniques for the kids whose why happens to be, I'm into performance sport. And there's many other kids whose needs need to be met, but I'm not throwing those out. They need to be there for those kids at that time if they're going to continue making progress and stay motivated. So yeah, absolutely, it has to be there as a groundwork, but I'm not sure we teach it, we live it, we display it, we model it, we challenge it. That's so important. Now, what do you do when the girls are getting those unwanted gazes from boys outside in a summer activity? That's when we need to have conversations, because that is presenting a severe obstacle to the kids who are victims of those unwanted gazes. It's not for them to deal with, that is for the boys to have to address, etc. So yeah, it has to be lived. I'm not sure it can be worked through a curriculum in lots of different ways, but it's more than quote unquote teach it. Sorry, I'm speaking far too much. I do apologize.
Thank you, Greg. Lee, I'm not sure if you want to respond on that particular point or not.
Yeah, a lot of it I agree with Greg on that one. I think a slight contradiction, I guess, in the fact that I'm hearing, on one hand, you know, social justice, we can deliver that. We're not quite sure how but that is something that we can deliver through a PE curriculum, but then there are other things that we can't, other concepts that we can't. So I'm not quite sure if what I'm hearing is there are, you know, concept curriculum or conceptual learning in PE does have a place, but it just depends on what the concepts that are being delivered. That's what I guess I'd like to clarify with Greg, if I might.
Yeah, so in the presentation, I made a distinction from concepts that are needed in the subject. So there's loads of concepts that underpin activities. I said every movement starts with a concept. That absolutely needs to be explored. And then those social justice concepts, if they're not strong, present, lived, understood by all, they're stopping physical activity. And that, for me, is our driver. That is our single goal. No why, no, you should be physically active because I think that's a journey that the young people should go on. I think by the time they leave school, they absolutely should be able to defend, articulate, express what they get from physical activity, how and why, and all the rest of it.
So conceptual learning has a place within PE.
I think, yeah. Sorry if I thought that was like I had to think 3 slides talking about what concepts should be there. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So concept has a place within PE. So I'm just trying to, again, we agree with it on a lot. I'm just trying to find out the exact differences. So conceptual learning has an absolute place within PE. The difference is the concepts you think that should be explored.
Well, my criteria, if you like, would be, is it in our lane? Is it absolutely at the heart of our subject? That's why I say this conversation is about the soul of our subject. If we're doing something to support something else, I think it diminishes our status. I'm going to teach this. I'm not saying you've come at it like this, but for example, you know, if we use PE to improve exam results, you know, no, that's not our role. Do you know what? To get good exam results, that's down to the exam-based teachers to create really inclusive, brilliant experiences and lessons to motivate their students. Yeah, well, that's not our role. Our role is around physical activity.
I think this is good timing, Ronnie, because I really do want to open this up. We've got brilliant minds in this call. Ronnie, go ahead.
Well, just quickly, of course, this is fantastic, isn't it? We're all buzzing. So thank you again, Greg and Lee. It's exactly the type of debate we should be having, isn't it? I don't know what other people are thinking around the room. It's as the debate goes on, I'm finally seeing more and more common ground. I'm also seeing truths at both. If there is polars here, I'm seeing truth at both polars, and actually the disagreement is narrowing, isn't it? I think Lee. I mean, I know he didn't say it as the driver, but he's never denied the fact that there is going to be some development of physical competence and physical movement and confidence. And I think Greg has made great reference to the fact that if the core curriculum is still based around physical movement and physical activity and developing high quality skills and confidence, that actually leads to, and can in the right context lead to, some development in some concepts. So I think, and both also challenge or at least agreed that it's very difficult to claim around the transferable things, because I'm secondary and sort of had my early success in secondary and then in performance sports. Of course, all our work now is in primary schools, and in primary schools, because same teacher, same group of staff with the same children, that transferable thing is a little bit easier. In secondary, that's really tough. And I think both of you agree, don't you, that that actually, that if you were really going to focus in on some, I mean, these are big hitters, some of the things that Lee's referring to, isn't he? Really big hitters. If we're going to contribute to those, then that has to be a whole school thing. I do agree that PE is uniquely placed, but I'm gonna stop for now, because hopefully I'll get another go later, so let others come in. But for me, the debate has narrowed down to which is the driver. So which comes first, and which bits and I think I'm going to use your phrase, Greg, because I did like it, which is which bits do we stay in lane, and which bits are we comfortable to be very deliberately contributing towards the development of a person and their development through schools, because schools have got some big issues to deal with. And I do disagree with Greg around the mental health contribution. Natasha Devon talks quite clearly about the peak of that being professional counsellors, but actually all of us, particularly in schools, having a responsibility to contribute towards that. But I do have great empathy and sympathy for Greg's view that there should be still at the heart of what we do that's unique is around core movement development, isn't it? And developing physical skills and physical competence to go and want to and feel, and both agreed on feelings. I'll step away now, James. Hopefully I get another go. But I had great sympathy, and I would also say I'm really persuaded by Lee that he does make it work. It is difficult, but I don't know if anyone else in the room, he came across as very believable to me that he is making this work.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Ronnie. I really want to open things up with Vicky, Will, and Phil, and just invite you to come in and to share your thoughts, folks.
I don't mind going.
Hi, Vicky.
I'd written a couple of things earlier in preparation. So as most people that have spoken already have said, I think that there are great points on both sides, and I think we are all here because we want the young people that we work with to become physically active for life, and want to enjoy physical activity and want to enjoy movement and get the most out of it that they can. I really struggled with Greg's point of maybe context isn't key, because I'm very much in agreement with Lee on this, that context is key. From like a social constructivist lens, we all experience the world through our own unique experiences. When we are planning a curricula for our schools alongside our departments is no different. Like the way I see my own school currently is totally different to how any of you will see your schools and the environments you work in. I've worked not just as a teacher, but before I was teaching, I've worked across different schools. I'd be in like 5 or 6 different schools in a day, working with really disaffected young people. And, each one I had to approach differently in a different way, because the context was key. I couldn't do the same activities in one school. I couldn't speak the same way to the students in other schools. I had to adapt constantly. So if context isn't key, then we're saying there's a one-size-fits-all approach. We know that isn't the case. There isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. I also loved Laura's point, and I kind of knew what Laura was going to say already, because we'd already had a little chat about it. So I got a bit of a heads up on that one. But I really enjoyed your talk with Dr. Srihan Lynch last week, James, and when she talks about that idea of democracy in PE. People like researchers like Dylan Landy have spoken about PE being a hyper-normative and heteronormative place, and I 100% agree with that. And if we continue to push and maintain this kind of traditional sports and games-driven model, then PE will continue to be that heteronormative place. As a member of the LGBTQ community, I know personally from my own experiences with many of my friends that PE wasn't a safe space for them and us growing up. And for me, if changing to a concept-based curriculum can benefit just one student, and one kid goes, actually, it's not so bad, I don't hate PE anymore, I don't hate the idea of movement, I don't hate the idea of being physically active, because instead of how many passes can you do in a minute, we've said, okay, you're going to set a goal for today, and your goal might be about an interpersonal skill, and your aim is to communicate with your teammates 4 times during a game, something like that, for instance, right? And they do it and they achieve that, and at the end they can say, I achieved my goal for today. I felt like I had success, I felt like I had enjoyment. And if that pushes them to want to be involved in the future in more things, then for me that's success, and that's what that looks like. I will caveat that with, I think we need to be really careful with the idea of life skills, about which life skills. Looking at some research from Rankainen in 2021, this phrase stuck out. life skills appear suspiciously like a colonialist project aimed at promoting Western individualism, neoliberalism, and associated values. They offer little capacity for young people and athletes to think and act differently. So I think it comes down to, what are these life skills? We've talked so much, we always talk about resilience for some reason. What are they, and whose skills are they? Like, who is it for us to say these are the skills that you should be promoting and that you should have, and that this will help you in your life, you know? So I think there's a lot to be said for this concept-based curriculum in terms of inclusivity, but at the same time, we have to be careful with what kind of concepts we are addressing. And the last thing I wanted to say was, again, it's anecdotal and it's qualitative, and I like qualitative research because I like human experience. Looking at my most recent student voice feedback from a unit I did at the beginning of the year, I liked having some actual goals to aim for. I kept them in mind each lesson, and I found that PE was more enjoyable this way. And for me, reading something like that, yeah, I had 5 comments saying I loved playing basketball, I love playing handball, I love playing football. But reading a comment like that, I go, okay, that kid, we're onto something here. They've been able to set themselves a goal around a communication skill and interpersonal skill, and they've come away enjoying the experience. And that's for me is a massive positive.
Can I address the issues Vicky raised? Thank you very much, Vicky. It's really nice to meet you and put a sort of moving face to your Twitter handle. And so the issue on context, apologies for any confusion there. Of course, I think context is important when it comes to all the decision making that you described: choice of activity, the location, the facilities available, the cultural heritage or otherwise, or we can have a chat about diverse range of activities. I think that's somewhat problematic, but and I'll come back to that in a second. But yeah, what forms the curriculum, the pedagogical approaches, all of that, of course, it's context driven. You know, I worked in inner London my whole teaching career, and you know, being super student sensitive, student centered was, well, absolutely essential. That's connections and you know, really caring, you know, not in a soppy way, but like genuinely caring and being in the on the side of your students was, you know, what we tried to do every day I went to work there. So I'm not saying that's not important. I'm saying that to justify a very bold and extensive piece of work, as Lee has put out, as well, it works for me in my context. I think I have problems with that, because, you know, look at the title of the book, Moving Forward. You know, it is a way to move forward. There are lots of ways to move forward. There are lots of things to explore. Now, Ronnie was talking about me putting movement at the heart of it. Actually, I tried to say in my presentation, I put the heart at the heart of it. It's kids falling in love with physical activity. Now, movement competency might be a part of that. It might not. It could be loads of, you know, in meaningful PE work, they talk about a transaction. The kid has to have a buy-in. And the last point I was to make on what Vicky said was, my critique, I suppose, actually comes, I'm not a traditionalist. You know, Lee and I had a chat about what does it mean to stay in the lane. Stay in the lane does not mean to keep it as it is. It means let's be really clear what our work is. I'm not advocating that there doesn't need to be change. I've advocated for 14 years in teacher education that we really need serious change. You know, I'm actually coming from a much more radical perspective than what Lee presents in his book. You know, you mentioned it in the work of Nora Verkunen, who's someone I've got the utmost respect for and had the pleasure to talk to a number of times. I think she's absolutely brilliant. And, you know, she spoke about, I thought it might be a little bit not appropriate for this session, but, you know, what I was trying to say to Lee was that the concepts chosen were from a very neoliberal perspective, employability to get good jobs. You know, how do we decide the concepts that define a good life? I got serious problems, philosophical problems with that are beyond the scope of this conversation. But that's the perspective that I'm coming from, that it really is born out of that, you know, and the other thing there... Everyone
believes Greg genuinely believes with you around the feelings. I'll let others speak, but that creating that positive relationship with physical activity genuinely is the heart of everything. But I know that Lee made reference to that too, didn't he? And I think that's a common thing. And Vicky's, again, her motivation was around, again, creating a positive connection, wasn't it? A positive feeling for every child. So I'll come off again, James, because there's so many others to speak, but I would emphasize that we all are agreeing around the feelings thing.
Thank you, Ronnie.
Go on, I'll jump in there. So obviously I have to preempt anything that I say by making you all understand that I represent currently a very different region of the world to the ones that you guys are coming from. And actually Vic and I talk a lot, so quite a lot of the things that I would have said Vic has sort of alluded to. And I know that the term context is contentious. I know it can be contentious and it can be taken out of context itself, but it is, in my experience as a Middle Eastern British international school PE teacher, absolutely key, because the context in which I educate children is vastly different to the context that anybody else on this call or Laura is teaching in. We have very different demographics, we have very different cultural aspects to consider. You know, when we're looking at things like social justice, it's with a very unique mirror, because we are in a completely different environment. What I would say is that in our experience here in Al Ain in the UAE, a concept-based curriculum has allowed us to engage with pupils in a slightly different way. So whilst we have absolutely not moved away from having physical activity at the heart of everything we do, what it's allowed us to do is to broaden those contact points and those little opportunities to give those sparks of enthusiasm to a wider range of pupils. You know, I came into this school 4 years ago and PE was effectively dead in the water. You know, the vast majority of my native pupils just did not engage with PE because the PE that they were experiencing had no cultural relevance to them whatsoever. You know, in the podcast last week, there was a conversation about not looking like your pupils, and we find that massively in this part of the world. That, you know, we don't look like the vast majority of our pupils. If we try and force our perceptions of what PE was that came from our experience of PE into that completely different cultural community, then we're always going to face a barrier to increased engagement. And concepts, adding concepts into our physically rich curriculum has just given us an opportunity to really engage with pupils in different ways, not alternative ways, but different ways, to have different conversations. And actually, possibly most importantly in my context, to give pupils opportunities to have another developmental phase in things that are really relevant to them. So, you know, we talk about diplomacy, we talk about negotiating skills, we talk about how to get your point across, communication, those are our concepts, because the type of pupils we're educating are going to need those skills. You know, I possibly not going as far as things like mental health issues. I have some, I think I probably agree with Greg to a certain extent on that particular piece, that I don't feel that we as international PE teachers are really qualified to go into that in too much depth. But we looked at the areas that really were going to give our students a broader opportunity to develop as young humans, and that's what drove our engagement with concept curriculum. There's no questions in that. That's just my perspective.
Yeah, if I could quickly say, you know, if you just take, and this is, I'm just trying to really clarify what I'm saying. If you take that concept, if it is a concept of communication, probably what Nora would have called a skill, but let's just take communication. And you said because they need that skill. So my question is, when do they need that skill? Now, in sport and physical activity, many people, not all people, need to be able to communicate effectively to other people, whether that be for performance reasons or whether that be to be sensitive to the needs of other people and make people around them feel good. absolutely great. But the evangelists in us say, if they can do it on a basketball court or a rugby field, they're great communicators away from there. And that's my issue. That's not our lane. And you know what? I've come across countless fantastic communicators on a rugby field who are the most sexist, misogynistic, homophobic people I've met. They don't communicate well to anybody apart from the blokes, and I use that word deliberately, who are like them. They're not great communicators, but they do need to learn how to communicate so that we have a positive environment. You know, someone makes a mistake next to you, there's your communication punch the air moment. You know, their kid said, head up, next time we're going to smash it, we're going to do it great. You know, that's great communication in context. So from an ecological perspective, you know, all skills are so specific to the context that I just worry when we think that they could be carried here, there and everywhere, because I really don't think there's a lot of evidence that they can.
I'm really mindful that we haven't involved Will so far, and Will, you by no means feel you have to if you're happy listening, but I would really like to give you the opportunity.
Greg, those blokes you've just described, it sounds like they're good communicators. We're just not comfortable with what they're communicating. But that's not what I want to say. I guess I hear and agree with lots that both of you are saying, and the bit that I can paint a picture of is the typical lesson that Lee's describing. And I guess what has helped me is I was tasked with trying to spread personalised learning and thinking skills in the mid-2000s across a load of schools. My way to broach that was I got to figure out how it works in my lane, in my PE lessons first. And what I found was it made my PE lessons more meaningful, more valuable, more relevant, have more currency for some of the children that weren't mini-me's. So the kids that didn't connect with me found a way to connect in my lessons because of that other thing, whether it be communication skills or team working or being a self-manager or being a critical thinker, whatever it was, it gave them something, a hook, something to grab a hold of. So I can, I guess, see that in Lee's lessons, and I can think back to how that was working for me, and it worked when I spread it across the school. It became a cultural thing that helped get a number of schools out of special measures, I believe. But Greg, what I can't do is, and I love your app and I love the nudge that it does, and I love the journaling and the feelings and the thinking, but I can't paint a picture of, you're telling me that PE needs to change, but I can't paint a picture of the typical lesson that you want it to look and feel like, that is different to sport technique, but also not in that changed lanes of concept. So can you paint that picture for me?
Yeah, and I accept that. You know, I haven't, and I absolutely accept I haven't put it out there in a package in a book, but I've spent, you know, I've worked with, for 14 years, I worked with 340 trainee teachers. And over time, and I spent 2 years working with over 600 teachers in India and developing exactly that. What's my vision of the PE lesson? So I said in the presentation, I think thinking and moving have to go together. So some little tips that might give you a flavour. In 14 years in teacher education, I banned my trainees using the word drill. Why? Because there's an absence of thinking in there. There's nothing open. There's no exploration in there. And I worked up a curriculum, a lesson design that was our default. It wasn't prescribed, but it was a default. And the reason it was a default is certainly for the first 2/3 of teacher education year was that this is different to what you would have done as a kid and what you've come to teacher education thinking that PE is: skills, drills, games. And it worked like this. And I'm not claiming that this is radically new, but it's very, very different to what you're suggesting. It worked with, so little language. So for example, like we didn't set learning outcomes that were around skills. So passing was about keeping possession, massively conceptualized. What do you need to do to keep possession? So let's just run with that example, for example. So first part of this is the lesson, okay? Short starter activity related to where it's going. Then we play with constraints-led activity, and it should be an authentic activity that's got a key question underpinning it that has minimal teacher input. So it might be, how do we keep the ball in 4 versus 4? And the individual teams, each person on each team has keeping track of how many times they're keeping the ball consecutive passing. This is a very basic model. This is applied to any activity. They're keeping the ball and they know that they've got maybe 8. But the key question is, what does your team need to display in order to keep the ball? We come in, we quickly discuss, we've got our success criteria, we need to move into space, we need to be deceptive, we need to do blah, blah, blah. Okay, we need to move the ball quickly. Loads of thinking, loads of concept that's very clear to the eye and evidenceable. Right, what was the hardest part of that? What did you struggle with? Inaccurate passing,
Greg,
not getting away from my marker.
Greg, I'm bursting here because I think you're describing a lesson that I'm convinced doesn't look much different to what Lee's described or what Will's described, or the sort of thing that Vicky and Phil are doing in their lessons. I think that we are talking around some
but I haven't baked in life skills. I understand.
I do recognise that. I do recognise that difference, Greg. I do.
But the success is after we've practiced, sure. And then when we put it back, have you got more passes? No. Yes, high five. No, great, because we can see stuff.
Sure, but
you see that the learning, William. That's assessment for learning. That's connecting as progress.
Definitely the process, but do you understand that the relevance of that doesn't sit up? So in my year 11 report for my daughter, it said, the second to bottom, it said, the PE one, it said, Molly now is hitting the ball flatter over the net in table tennis to make it more difficult for a partner to return it. And then the one underneath was history. And it said, Molly was comparing and contrasting 2 different sources, debating it with her colleagues, and then sharing and summarising that resource. I couldn't help thinking history was more important than PE when I saw that report.
Okay.
And what we're doing is...
But that's assessment of... That's assessment.
Sure. But what you're describing is a really good lesson.
But my assessment is baked into our app that we've done, which is just about the kids' relationship with physical activity. Full stop.
Absolutely. But what Lee described, and I think what you're describing, and certainly Will did it really articulately in a very short space of time, but is that actually that a good learning environment, a good high performance environment, is pretty much the same whether that's in a really responsible business, or it's a sport team approach, or it's in an education establishment like yours, Greg. And that'll be around people who are collaborating, people who are taking self-aware. Those rugby players you described as being homophobic, so trust me, there won't be high quality rugby players, Greg. I don't believe that to be true, because actually they wouldn't get the team chemistry and that empathy and diversity and listening to others and growing with others.
There's internationals who are homophobic, Ronnie.
Well, I do accept that. But what for certain. But what I would say is that we can, if by creating the right environment. So I think we're still left with a debate, which I don't think will end tonight, and I'll finish now with what is the core purpose and the core driver. I still think we're left with that. But I know for certain with what Lee's describing and what others are describing as real high quality experience and lessons, an environment, inclusive environment, is the environment that's required for those child to have accelerated learning, deeper learning, strengthened learning, and to create a sense of inclusion and a sense of belonging and a sense of relevance in what they're doing. And so I'm massively behind the feelings, massively behind the physical unique element being the core part of the curriculum. But the way in which it's being presented to children is so important in this, and it would be in any high performance environment for learning to take place. And therefore, it's not a choice between the two. It's actually both driving each other. It's not, Vicky used the word distraction. I think it's a great word. We're not being distracted away from it. We're actually enhancing the learning of those things by focusing on some of those concepts.
I really respect what you're saying, Bronnie. Just to put it into context, or to clarify for myself, Will wrote the foreword for Lee's book. Vicky reads everything that's going. Phil's working really closely. Have you had a chance to look through Lee's book?
Are you asking that question to Ronnie?
To Ronnie, yeah.
No, sorry. All I've had is listen to the podcast that was linked in before we came here. So I have, and obviously listen to Lee and yourself speak tonight. So no, I haven't, Greg.
Yeah. So I want in my lessons to go to Will's question. I want to capture the kids being brilliant, the kids making progress in any domain, moving their attitudinal domain or their thinking domain. So if a kid is moving into space better than they did earlier, and again, this goes back to, we spent ages talking about what do you praise? And to be able to say, you're moving into space much better, you must have really been paying attention. You must have really practiced hard. That's massively away from, well done, you've got 30 catches in 10 seconds or whatever rubbish we used to come up with. So I hope that answers your question.
But that is praising the behaviour, Greg. So I think you've now turned, honestly, you're still now saying the concepts around our behaviours, around our resilience, around risk-taking, around taking, going the extra mile.
Absolutely, because they're embedded in the subject. Yeah, they're in physical activity.
But that's the only debate. It's about whether it's bedded in our approach,
or whether we go wide,
or whether it's
we
ultimately
transfer.
our outcomes. Is that the only?
I said in the presentation, Lee talks about transferability over 80 times. And I think that's a really dangerous road for the profession to go down.
Sorry to jump in, but we're looking at this relevancy, and we're looking at Ash Casey looked at it, and I've said about Stephanie Benny have looked at it. When students can see the learning that can be transferred to current or future contexts, that is something that makes it meaningful. The lesson that you've just described, the only thing that is different is your students might be engaged in that 4v4, but in my context, they weren't. So by me saying we're going to look at communication today, I want you to do 4v4, and then we're going to connect that communication to that 4v4 or 4 passes that you mentioned. The only difference in your lesson to my lesson is just that very slight focus, if you like. And those teachable moments, I say to my staff, reward for attitude and progress, not for performance and ability. So it's those teachable moments. It's finding that person that has made the progress. It's finding that student that maybe hasn't made the progress yet, but it hasn't given up. It is changing those teachable moments. And it is so I honestly believe, Greg, and I know maybe the life skills you don't give, but what you've just described and what I am delivering and what I advocate are so similar. And maybe the context that I've gone with, that I've gone with in my school, because the students told me they wanted life lessons, so we've gone with employability. I work in a grammar school, so I mean, ambition is always high, university. And I've worked in another state school where maybe I wouldn't have used those concepts because they wouldn't have got that relevancy, they wouldn't have got that buy-in. Maybe social justice, definitely social justice should be something that is incorporated into a concept curriculum. What I'm saying is, in what I've written, and I'm not precious at all. I say it in the book, I say it in any training I've done, whenever I help out other departments or lead presentations. This is my concept curriculum. I want to help you write yours, and it's very similar, as I just mentioned there, to what you're describing.
I'm going to James. Oh, sorry, James. Just two things, because I'm quite conscious. I'm quite conscious that once this is finished and is live, we're going to have an audience and people listening. And there were 2 really key things that were just said by at least 2 different people that I just want to highlight for anybody that's listening, because I think it's really important. First of all, Ronnie and Greg both said that what we're really looking for, paraphrasing, are opportunities to showcase, or for pupils to showcase success in whatever that might be. Because, and it's a little bit of a plug because it's something, it's what my book is about, but the more success that those pupils can identify in themselves and can display, the more motivation we're going to drive to continue to have those successful experiences. So I think that's really important. And then the second thing is that assessment doesn't always need to be the same as the content in the lesson. So you can be delivering a lesson just like the one that Greg just described, which is very, very similar to the type of lessons that we would adopt here. However, we could also be looking for successful leadership. We could be also looking for successful teamwork. And we don't necessarily need to be explicit about that in the lesson content, but we can be looking to identify that and then praising and rewarding those successes when they're achieved. Again, no question. I just thought that was important to highlight.
Thank you, Phil. It's a great contribution, and folks, I'm gonna draw us together, because I promise you all we would be out by 9 o'clock UK time. It's already 20 past. That I genuinely believe we could go for another hour and a half here. I think it's about 1 o'clock in the morning for Phil, who's an absolute angel for staying up so late, and Vic not far off either over in Italy, and we really appreciate it. And for all of us who are just merely in the UK, it's getting towards 9:30 in the evening, and our families are probably in the other room wondering what the hell we're doing. So I think it's really important we do that. I'm going to hand over the last words to Lee and to Greg, just to allow people who have listened and seen this just to be able to access their work and sort of take potential next steps with them. But I also want to say something that's both deeply professional but also highly personal. I have sat back and listened and absorbed a conversation this evening that I damn wish was available to me 20 years ago when I was a trainee PE teacher, and I could have consumed. And I don't know if you realize I honestly don't know how you feel going out of this conversation this evening, but I tell you right now, Lee, Greg, Phil, Ronnie, Vic, Will, Laura, you have done an immensely impactful job, or I guess we can't be sure of the impact, we can't measure that, so I'll take that one back. You have delivered something immensely inspiring here tonight, and I really, really thank you for it. And I also want to make a couple of apologies, specifically because I really wanted to, I've had so many emails this week to put to you guys, but to Chris Wade, to Rachel Dathan. Chris talked to me about IB in Saudi Arabia. Rachel Dathan talked about the new Welsh curriculum and wanted me to raise it. Aaron Davey wanted me to ask about whether lessons had to be directed or whether they could be sort of student-led. Liam Grest posted a remarkable email. Carl Broom from Sherborne School in Qatar posted an epic email to me, and I really wanted to bring your points up this evening. I haven't had the opportunity to do so.
We need a part two.
Yeah, we may well need a part. Martin and I have done next to
I've got
nothing.
some points that have been raised here in the
chat.
Yeah,
and we will find a way of the pure chat that's been written here is valuable in itself, and we'll post that too. I'd like to switch back to Greg first, and then Lee finally, just to allow the opportunity to sum up anything you want clarifying, but also to allow people knowledge of where they can access you, your work, your thinking. Far away.
Well, first of all, thanks to everyone, and I do apologise. I feel like I've spoken far too much, and if I have, it's only because of I care hugely about what we're talking about. Huge respect again to everyone on the panel. I love and your work. I followed it from afar or on social media, and huge respect to Lee, as I say, for immense undertaking. As you said at the intro, I'm currently I've been out of higher education and teacher education since last April, where I'm now working on miMove, and I believe Lee, we're chatting about it tomorrow, which I look forward to, and that really ties in to what we're saying. We developed miMove, born out of the themes that we've been exploring. That teachers, we've all agreed about this strong connectivity to physical activity, yet we've never had a way of knowing if our kids that we're working with are active. And I think that was nothing short of bizarre. So the notion of nowcasting, knowing what the situation is now, so that we could do better going forward, is exactly why we've spent a huge amount of resourcing and time and effort in developing an app that equips people like those on the call and people who are listening to be able to gauge, to have a dashboard. And as I said to Lee, you know what, if we meet next year and he can show that what he's doing is really seriously turning the kids on to physical activity, and their weekend physical activity is off the scale and is going up and all the rest of it, I absolutely take my hat off to Lee and any other teacher in our profession who is giving the kids that wonderful gift of that love for physical activity. So thank you to everyone who will listen to it. Thank you for everyone on the panel. Thank you.
Well done, Greg. Over to you, Lee.
Yeah, I echo Greg's thoughts there. Thanks to everybody on the panel. Thanks for everybody on Twitter that's engaged. I've had, since the book come out, and I knew it would be controversial, and I can, as a head of PE, I can write about my experience, I can research, I can evidence as much, but appreciate the thoughts and the feedbacks around it and the conversations that it started. And I think at the very least, you know, whatever your approach is, whatever you decide to do with regards to delivering those positive and meaningful experiences, I welcome it. I really welcome. Well, I think we're heads of PE are in this kind of situation where we're just bored of waiting. We're bored of sitting down and seeing nothing happening. And so there's so many, especially on Twitter, there's so many outstanding PE teachers and leaders that are now saying enough of the lack of impact or doing more harm than good. Let's try and change it. And that was where the concept curriculum came from. And you know, don't listen to Greg's review on Amazon. It's not true reflective of the book. It does look a lot about assessment, about pedagogy, about inclusive pedagogy, and I also talk about this idea of personality pathway, which I genuinely believe and share the contributions of so many. So even if the concept curriculum isn't for you, there is loads in that book that hopefully will be. But I do believe in the concept curriculum, and I do believe that the idea that whatever the concepts that you believe, and we'll talk about the who, I do believe if you know your why, if you know your purpose in your school or why PE exists, and you try and realize that, that's hugely important for every single department. I want to leave with a couple of questions, if I may. So I just, for those listening, I guess the things that I want you to consider is your PE curriculum meeting your personal why? If it's not, then something needs to change. Is your current PE curriculum meeting your department's intent? Is it nurturing? Is it genuinely nurturing physical literacy? Is it doing what miMove is trying to find? You know, is it genuinely changing those emotions? Are those students engaging in physical activity, not just in PE because they have to, but outside because they want to? Does it prepare students for life, or to be more specific to what Greg I know cares more about, and I care as much about, does it prepare them for an active life? And will it transform them into, you know, physically active adults and lifelong movers? If the answer to any of those is no, then it needs to change, and it's really worth exploring what that change is. And I'm happy to engage with anybody on Twitter. We have a concept curriculum community on Twitter. Just drop me a message and I'll add you into it. And Lee_Sullivan85 is my Twitter handle. So I welcome any conversation. And the concept curriculum already tonight will evolve, and it should always evolve. And everything we're delivering will always evolve. Just because I'm teaching employability now, it might not be relevant in 2 years' time or whatever it is. And I welcome those conversations as well. So thank you, everybody. And yeah, to the future of PE.
Well done, well said, Lee, and a great way to summarise. I'm deeply proud to be a PE teacher this evening. To one and all who have taken part in this, my heartfelt respect and thanks and sincerest gratitude for the time, the thought, it means so much. Well done, everyone.